Okay, now we're underway. Okay, great. Okay, so let me try to sketch my motivating problem for this book. So we live in an age of growing dissatisfaction with the standard workings of representative democracy. And there's a solution which is posed by a long radical democratic tradition of the unmediated power of the people. So whether it's mass plebiscites, mass popular votes, or mass protest movements, these can be celebrated as these expressions of popular power, which can transcend ordinary institutional politics, get above all the muck and grime of the ordinary workings of government. But the outcomes of these mass political phenomena is often just as disappointing as the ordinary politics they seek to overcome, which makes people pretty skeptical about democracy in general. So in my book, which is called Potentia, Hobbes and Spinoza on Power and Popular Politics, I try to offer a new understanding of what it means to talk about popular power. And the title of the book has the word potentia. It's a Latin word for power. In Latin, they make a distinction between two different words for power. One is potentia and one is potestas. I'll explain a little bit more this distinction as we go along, but the method by which my book operates is by looking back to some early modern thinkers and tracing this term potentia, this particular conception of power, to dig up a new way of thinking about popular power that should help us out of this this impasse that I've just mentioned very briefly. Okay, and so on this revisionist conception of popular power, which I develop reading these historical texts, I'm going to say that a political phenomenon can said to be expressed popular power when it's both popular, by which I mean it's going to eliminate oligarchy and encompass the whole polity. So it's not going to have undue influence from certain different parts of the polity. It's going to have equal influence and from the whole of the polity. And also powerful. For something to be popular power, it has to be powerful. And by that, I mean it's going to robustly determine political and social outcomes. And so popular power is best shown by a robust institutional order that durably avoids oligarchy and generates rule for the common good. And from this point of view, of this understanding of popular power, plebiscites and social movements, which the radical Democrats thought of the quintessential definition of popular power, they're not rejected, but they're no longer the central instances of popular power. They may or may not express popular power. Okay, so to lay out my argument, I just want to say a little bit more about these, try to motivate and draw you into what's intuitively appealing about these radical democratic, we the people kind of views, and also show how they are grounded in the early modern texts that form the bulk of my book's discussion. And so I established this new idea of popular power, new by drawing on old sources, but this revisionist idea of popular power against two radical traditions. One of those is what I sketch as the American public law tradition, and the other is what I call a European post-Marxist tradition. So standing as a representative of what I'm calling the American public law tradition, I have Richard Tuck. Richard Tuck is a historian of political thought working at Harvard, and he has a recent book called The Sleeping Sovereign, which draws together themes of much of his earlier work as well. And in that book, he revives Hobbesian absolute democratic sovereignty as a model worthy of our attention in the present. So Tuck says, yes, we all know that Hobbes didn't like democracy as a form of government, but Hobbes actually really was okay with democracy as a form of sovereignty. And for Hobbes, if you have the whole populace expressing their voice through pure non-deliberative plebiscitary voting, so everybody, the problems for him in Tuck's reading, the problem that Hobbes had with democracy was that when you're in a parliament, you have all sorts of grandstanding and terrible stuff going on. But if only you could just have the vote of the people giving a clear answer as to how things should be, this would be a good model of democracy. And for Hobbes calls this democratic sovereignty, he calls it a sleeping sovereignty. The idea is you could have the people as sovereign because in principle at any moment they could come together and vote en masse on the direction of the country, even though the day-to-day governance is done by a government, which may have whatever structure you like. And so this links to American public law ideas of we the people, that whatever goes on in ordinary politics from time to time, we the people can come together and vote and determine the basic direction of the country. At least at the time of the initial floating of the Brexit vote, Richard Tuck thought that was a good idea because it was allowing the voice of the people, the power of the people, the absolute democratic sovereignty to be expressed through direct plebiscitary view. Okay, so Hobbes stands behind that one tradition of radical democracy. On what I call the European post-Marxist tradition, we have in the popular imagination, I don't know whether it's your popular imagination, but in the great popular success of Antonio Negri's trilogy, Empire, Multitude, Commonwealth, that have come out sort of from about 1990, 99, over the next decade or so. This series of sort of popular academic crossover books put forward a notion of neo-Spinoza's radical insurgent democracy. So rather than focusing on plebiscites, for Negri, the power of the people is when they rise up. So unmediated mass movement activity is supposed to be the privileged site of the power of the people. And so Negri draws, to ground this idea, Negri draws on Benedictus Spinoza, who is a 17th century philosopher, just like Hobbes. And so Spinoza has a notion of the multitude, which is the pre or extra institutional collective mass of society. And in Spinoza's work, the idea of the power of the multitude pops up regularly. And so on Negri's reading of this, when social movements or protest movements or press claims, that is the power of the multitude, which is this pre-institutional power of people, more authentic than any authorized or representative institution. Okay, so two broad traditions, which each in their different way take popular power to lie before or in advance of its various everyday governmental institutionalization. And so focusing on plebiscites and these moments of popular voice cutting through that ordinary politics. And so to me, this seems to raise many difficulties. I worry about the popularity of these alleged instances of popular power. So I don't know how familiar Joseph Schumpeter is to you. Joseph Schumpeter famously says what's wrong with this sort of view of popular power. He says that the people's will is a product rather than a driver of the political process. If you want a simple example to get this idea, in the Brexit vote, there was a lot of commentary afterwards about how there'd been people's preferences on this question were driven by misleading, in part by misleading advertising campaigns, by interested actors, political actors. You can bring your own example where the popular view doesn't pre-exist the activities of various agents in society. It is produced in particular by certain political actors pushing whatever agenda they may have. And so another problem for the idea of the popularity of these forms of supposedly popular power is sometimes you have popular movements competing with one another in the popular sphere. So how can one side of these claim to speak for the people if there are multiple popular movements, often fiercely opposed to one another? I also worry about the power of these supposedly canonical instances of popular power. I mean, how much influence do plebiscites and social movements have on the day-to-day operation of governance? And so isn't it paradoxical to say that a polity, which is basically, run by various oligarchs, but occasionally has a plebiscite or occasionally has a big social movement stirring things up, isn't it paradoxical to say that that is a better expression of popular power than than a well-ordered polity which serves the common good in a more boring but reliable way. Okay, and so in public life, it's common to credit plebiscites and social movements as manifesting the power of the people. But when these plebiscites and movements lead to unjust, irrational, evanescent political outcomes, I think people often struggle to accommodate their intuitive normative commitment to democracy with the really disappointing reality. And so in my book, I take these, I suppose, Schumpeterian worries very seriously, but where Schumpeter uses those worries to basically throw the idea of popular power in the bin, I don't abandon it. In the book, I try to develop a new and better conception of popular power. So that's the first section of what I wanted to present by trying to really motivate for you where the book is intervening in kind of the world of ideas that you can grasp outside of the finer points of historical texts. I want to now move into an overview of the core textual and conceptual claims that I'm going to make. So let me see how I go. I might go a little bit quickly through the finer points of the Hobbes and Spinoza on the basis that while I tried to do due diligence in the book with them, I think for this audience, it's more important to see what the result of those investigations is. Okay, so the book proceeds by a detailed study of the philosophies of Thomas Hobbes and Benedictus Spinoza, and in particular by their concepts of power, potentia rather than potestas, this Latin distinction I mentioned before. To give a broad contrast, potestas is a little bit closer to authority, and potentia is a bit more like capacity, or I sometimes call it concrete power. It's the same term that's used in the natural sciences for all sorts of entities in terms of their power. And so exactly what these terms, exactly how you pin them down is what I negotiate with the book. That's why I can't give a more precise characterization in advance. And so in the book, I agree with the radical Democrats that Hobbes and Spinoza are really relevant for thinking about popular power. But on my reading, it's not because of their support for the radical view, but because of the very resources they provide to critique it and have an alternative view. Okay, so potentia. This is a central scientific and philosophical term for power in the early modern period, especially in the natural sciences. But there are two fundamentally different ways to understand potentia: the way of the old scholastic natural science and the way of the new mechanical natural science. So this is my sort of foray into the history of philosophy of science, that there's this big transition, maybe the sharpness of which the partisans of the new science like to overemphasize and exaggerate. There was a bit more continuity, but we can sketch broadly two different attitudes. So both Hobbes and Spinoza are writing at the time of this, the retreat of the old scholastic view and the new mechanical view is becoming dominant in the natural sciences. And they're in conversation with some of the leading figures in this transition, such as Descartes. And in a nutshell, my book finds a similar transition in their political writings, but I think the radical Democrats are sort of stuck in the old scholastic worldview. And so the revisionist conception of political power is a bit close, somehow analogous to this mechanical notion of power in natural sciences. Let me explain a little bit more what I mean by that. So let me sketch the difference between two ways of thinking about power. On the scholastic view, a thing's power identifies its own proper nature. At least in natural entities where free will doesn't intervene, this nature tends to be expressed for the most part. It offers an explanation of phenomena in the natural world that's simultaneously descriptive and normative. The natural world is understood as a domain of proper entities endowed with natural and proper tendencies. So fire warms, its power is to warm, a seed grows, a rock falls down. And of course, that can be, those natural tendencies can be pushed against, but each thing has its own natural tendency. The new mechanical science is deeply suspicious of this view of power and is often quite polemical in its criticisms, calls these occult powers. the playwright Molière satirizes this, and he's got a doctor in one of his plays, says a sleeping potion works due to its dormitive virtue. And the joke is that it's really inane to explain a thing's properties by simply positing an underlying power or virtue that causes those self-same properties. And so for the mechanical, no doubt this is a caricature of the earlier view, but nonetheless, for the new science, they either throw out the concept of power altogether, or they keep it and use it in quite a different way. Instead of, power doesn't explain the effects that a thing might have. Instead it characterizes the actual effects that it has. So you're not pretending by saying something has a certain power, you're not pretending to point to some underlying explanation for how it is. You're just sort of saying that it tends to have these kind of effects. And so to apply this to the problem of popular power, on the scholastic view of power, if you say the people, the power of the people, that sort of leads you to this idea that there must be some underlying nature or tendency of the people which will tend to be expressed if it's not thwarted by external obstacles. And so I think you see this in the radical democratic view. There's some idea that the people have some underlying nature as an equal good collective oriented towards the common good. And if only these external pressures and distortions were removed, then it could express itself in a good way, as through plebiscites or through social movements. Now, on the mechanical view, which I find in both Hobbes and Spinoza, any power is something that is not an underlying explanation of a tendency, but is characterizing the actual production of effects, right? So the collective potentia, the power of a collectivity, is whatever characteristic effects it tends to have. And so the measure of a collective's power is its actual characteristic effects and outcomes over time. But if you take this view, then far from popular power being some inherent egalitarian substrate of human collective existence, on this view, which I kind of bring out and try to sort of defend, popular power is a difficult achievement. Collective power is not necessarily popular, because if you've got a group with any hierarchy or hostility amongst its members, the power of that group, the characteristic effects that it produces, will reflect that hostility or hierarchy. Nor is collective power necessarily particularly powerful, because sometimes a group of people just don't have very strong systematic effects. They have wavering or evanescent impacts on things, or random sort of impacts rather than systematic effects. Okay, and so the result is, the view of popular power that I'm sort of putting forward, drawing on Hobbes and Spinoza, is a political phenomenon can be said to express popular power when it's popular, eliminates oligarchy and encompasses the whole polity. Also powerful, so it robustly determines political and social outcomes. And rather than pointing to this as some underlying thing that needs to be uncovered and freed, instead, the challenge is how to bring that power about. And so plebiscites and social movements may play some role in that, but so too will the meticulous, boring, slow work of institutional design and implementation. And so concretely, I try to say that this conception of popular power I draw out of both Hobbes and Spinoza. But in terms of what specific institutional structures or forms might actually serve this best, I see a difference between them. And so I characterize the Hobbesian view as repressive egalitarianism. And I really have Singapore in mind when I say this. The idea is that you have, in order to avoid the problem of emergent oligarchic pressures within a democracy, you just crush all group formation and you have all of the individuals. You try to have an enlightened government that rules for the common good without there being any counterpowers or groups pressing against it. I hope I wasn't too controversial saying this is Singaporean, but you can press me on that later. Whereas the Hobbesian, the Spinozist view doesn't view sub-national groups purely as threats, but views them as potentially, under certain circumstances, helpful sort of counterweights that can help a polity as a whole achieve its ends better. So I've been going for about 20 minutes. I'm thinking that I'm not going to be able to take you through the finer details of what I do with Hobbes and Spinoza to bring this about. My argument operates both at the level of, I try to show that Hobbes actually moves from an early kind of scholastic influenced view to a later mechanical view. And then in Spinoza, I try to show, I think he was had the mechanical view throughout, but his radical interpreters mistakenly attribute to him a more scholastic view of this intrinsic power of the multitude, which is going to tend toward goodness. So maybe I'll just say, recognizing that I'm not representing the whole of those two arguments, I just want to draw out some themes that might, I hope, answer a little bit to what I'm wondering might be some of the background concerns of this audience. So in a lot of political philosophy, and in a lot of, quite rightly, in a lot of Hobbes studies, when you focus on what it is to focus on power or popular power, is to focus on the question of authority. And so I really don't want to deny that that's a central theme of, is the overriding theme of Hobbes's work. And so this is under the title of Potestas, his power as authority. And this view, this conception of throughout all of his works early in that, in no way I want to deny that for him, you could answer the question of what is popular power by saying who has the authority, who has the sovereignty, who has the right to rule. And if it's a democratic sovereign, then you just, it is kind of just stipulated that, whoever holds that sovereignty has it. And that sovereignty doesn't depend on these kind of institutional finer points that I'm bringing out. But what I try to do in the book is I try to bring to the fore the fact that Hobbes also, as well as his theory of authority, he also has this theory of concrete power. Early on, I think he doesn't. Early on, he has this idea that what could the sovereign's power be except the right to use all of the powers of all of the subjects? So you just sort of, it's almost sort of used to define what the authority is, and that's that, and doesn't have any other way of speaking about collective power except as an authority. What I try to show is later on, he realizes there's actually two ways that you can talk about power of a political order or of a sovereign. One is the question of authority, but separate from that is what which comes under the heading of Potentia, is a bit more of a question of capacity, right? So it's all very well to have the right to rule everybody in a society. That's fine if, in fact, people then sort of, for the most part, obey your orders. But if it's possible for those concrete powers to somehow diverge from the authorized power, then you've got a problem, right? So I think Hobbes initially thinks it's no problem. He's like, sovereign's got a big sword. It's got the right to your obedience. If you don't obey, it'll cut your head off. Everybody will fall in line, no problem. And what I try to show is that I try to show textually that later on he starts to worry about the way in which these two things can go apart. And in particular, the kind of worry that I draw out from his text, but I think is sort of quite intuitive once you think about it, is the way in which what I call informal powers can emerge. So even you can have, suppose there's somebody who's rich, they're going to have all sorts of hangers-on, and they're going to be able to sway processes in ways that they, according to their wishes. And so even if the sovereign has whatever sword to enforce, to demand that people obey, at a certain point, if there's informal power structures in the society, then waving a sword isn't necessarily going to, you might provoke an insurrection by trying to push back hard enough. And so I try to show for Hobbes himself that this question of, there's a problem to match the authority that you want your democratic sovereign to have with that actual capacity. And so I don't want to deny, of course, Hobbes is very interested, of course, in authority, but I want to show that he also has this interesting account of how you bring that sort of, I suppose, concrete popular power to meet the authority that is required. So the Spinoza side, I'm suspecting, is very much less familiar to this audience, I'm guessing. You may have, if the Negri books have pierced your consciousness, you would be aware that there's some idea that the, social movements and popular movements always are pushing in a good direction. I suppose the events of the past few weeks in the US might give pause to people about that. But I think this has been quite an influential idea, that what drives, that there's some tendency of the masses towards equality and demanding overcoming injustice. And this is seen to be grounded in Spinoza's metaphysics and seen to be in his politics. And I try to show that this is not textually accurate. To be sure, the power of the multitude is the foundation of any political order, but that applies to any good order, bad order, anything in between. And so, as I indicated in my introductory remarks, I try to show that for this power of the multitude to be worth calling a popular power, it will have to be structured in certain kinds of ways to make it the case that it brings about the durable effects for the common good that you're after. And if it doesn't, then that shows as a deficiency of popular power. So I'm really I'm really grateful to the Centre for Legal Theory for inviting me, and I really look forward to hearing what Mike has made of this book, which the bits that I skipped over in my comments are really mired in a sort of textual technicality to try to please all of my sort of philosophical and history of philosophy interlocutors, which may sometimes obscure these larger points that I hope I'm making. But I think I make a contribution to those more technical domains, but I hope that I've been able to explain my idea of what it is, this revisionist notion of what counts as popular power. And I hope that this provides a solution to the starting puzzle I set up and promises a way out of our disturbing oscillations that we may have between faith in and disappointment with democracy. And so, because on this view of popular power, a formal system of democracy may or may not express popular power to a high degree. Plebiscites and social movements may or may not express popular power rather, the degree of popular power depends on its concrete production of egalitarian effects durably over time. And so these social movements and plebiscites, which inspire such hope and then give such disappointment, are no longer the definitive expressions of popular power. They're potentially valuable elements within a broader vision of democracy. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing Mike's response. You're still muted, Mike?
Still muted, yes. I'm not an intellectual historian. Many people would suggest I'm not an intellectual at all. But so my focus is going to be on the last chapter, which is the one chapter that probably resonates more with my interest, because it's really dealing with the functionality rather than the history of popular power, which is what I think is more along the lines of what public law and public law scholars are interested in. I basically am just going to ask a number of questions. I'm still not clear what popular power is about. To me, it's based on two problematic metaphors: the people, and the people has problematic because we tend to anthropomorphize people. You kind of mentioned that in your critique. The people is not an anthropomorphic entity. And so to the extent it exercises a power, it does not exercise a power in the way that a person exercises the power, or even in the way that a small group exercises the power. And then there's a question of what is power. You talk about power as simply the production of an effect, but is that really sufficient for what you're doing? I mean, the people, the population of a country, in any country, exercise significant effect. It might not be an effect that's intended. It might not be an effect that's part of a larger, let's say, public will. Again, when we're talking about people, I'm curious about public will, whether that's a good metaphor. So it's hard to understand what we're getting to when we talk about popular power, at least from a functional perspective. And that gets me to the question of why not just abandon it like Schumpeter? You say you don't want to, but you never actually say why. What is it that the idea of popular power is capturing that we need to pay attention to from a functional perspective? What do we miss? What do we do wrong when we get this idea wrong? So one of the questions I had, what happens if we define popular power as meaning something else? You have a very definite definition of popular power means this. Why can't it mean something else? What happens if it means? What's the harm that's caused if we define popular power in some other way? And so what is it? From a functional perspective, what is it? How do I know it when I see it? From a effects perspective, how do I distinguish an effect from popular power that's just an effect from process? One of the things about popular power, however you define it, this is a public law perspective, is that it's probably a product of process, not a product of will. And it's a mechanical power. It's a power like the power that an engine produces in a car. It's not a power like political power, which is a power to shape the world in your particular way. It's spontaneous, arguably. It's spontaneous. Sorry, I lost my point where I was going. Why is popular power important? What exactly is it doing? What exactly is it contributing to the functioning of a polity? In some ways, the way you describe popular power, I would say it's present everywhere. Every place, the population, the dynamics, the spontaneous dynamics of population, organization, and mobilization have significant effects on the polity, on the government. So even in China, even in Singapore, Singapore is very concerned with the dynamics of popular dynamics, probably more sensitive to popular dynamics in the United States in some ways, because it's less bizarre sort of way, it's less controlled. Or I think they feel it's less controlled. I don't know. We can talk about that later. So that's and then the question then becomes, is your definition of popular power a tautology? So on the one hand, you say popular power is characterized by a particular form of equality, and then what's the other one? Sorry. Equality, and participation. But then you say the way you realize popular power is the way it's effectuated is through the same thing, through equality and participation. So what it is and how it's made become the same thing. So that I found that a little bit confusing. So again, it's what is it doing? What does it contribute? What do we lose when we don't have popular power, or we don't have it in the right way? And what does the notion itself tell us that we don't already know? To some extent, when you're talking about equality and participation, you reminded me of Rawls. So one of the questions I have is, how is this much different from Rawls in its conceptual or legitimating foundations? And then finally, I'm just wondering why Spinoza and Hobbes are relevant to this. I mean, they wrote and were writing in a world that just doesn't exist now, that stopped existing. They really had no experience with democracy, whatever that means. They certainly didn't have experience with anything resembling a modern form of government, a modern form of social structure. They didn't have experience with class. I mean, I understand that you're an intellectual historian, and I'm not saying they're irrelevant, but I'm saying for understanding the world today, I wonder if you might not have been better served by not talking about Spinoza, but just talking about you and just talking about the way you see the world as it is today, giving examples of how the world is today. Spinoza is interesting. He actually had a big influence on my life, but more in his psychology, his work on psychology than politics. So I'm not saying he's irrelevant, and I think he is very relevant for, again, intellectual history, which is a very valid field in and of its own right. But for doing what you're doing in the last chapter, I don't think he's relevant. I think that you would have been much better served if you would have just said from the very beginning, this is why I'm interested in it. This is what I think it accomplishes. Exactly sort of what I said. I think you kind of got sidetracked by the Spinoza-Hobbes debate. So I think I'm going to stop there. And that's it.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So let me try to come at this. I think so. I've got two big challenges, I suppose, from you, Mike, and I think they're welcome challenges. So let me see if I can rise to them. Okay, the first is like, why keep power? So I've got a book about Hobbes and Spinoza on popular power, and the question is, why keep power and why keep Hobbes and Spinoza? So we've got some pretty fundamental questions.
I'm just talking about your last chapter.
Yeah, okay.
So I can understand it with regard to the first 6 chapters, but your last chapter becomes a different project, and it's only with regard to the last chapter. Because I think it gives a coda which doesn't fit the theme itself.
Okay, so I suppose, so let me just answer that narrowly, but I do think it actually, I think it might have this sort of broader impact in a way that I think is interesting. So in the book, it's true that in the final chapter, I basically say, here's my definition of popular power, and let me give you some ideas of some kinds of mechanisms that that might bring it about. And I sort of take them courtesy of Spinoza. And then I have a bit of a caveat of saying, well, of course, 17th century things might not be useful for us here and now. But you're left wondering, well, you know, I suppose the question is a little bit why that 17th century political institutions are so remote from us now. Why do that? And I think that in a certain way, this is rounding off my fight within Spinoza studies about what Spinoza thought. And I'd like to think that the meta lesson from these, I think you're quite right. There's no conception of most of the you know, bread and butter of what a contemporary constitutional theorist has to think about, right? But I think it illustrates, if you think of the main axis of my book as distinguishing between this sort of idea of the people with this good power that then just needs to be allowed to express itself versus an idea of, you know, this good efficacy of the people having to be constituted rather than being some constituent prior. I think it illustrates that. But I kind of take your point. I do have some ambition one day to link up with more contemporary literature. So I take your point on, and the book does kind of end kind of abruptly with that. So I really take that point. But I think it raises a larger issue, and maybe I'll come at this through your question about why talk about power. And I hear that through your comments, I think you're like, well, you know, what is it to even be, you know, what is this, the people and power makes it sound like it's some sort of, there's some will that then expresses itself. And firstly, that doesn't sound like actually what's going on. And why do I want to even keep that term? I think, and Schumpeter certainly wants to just throw it out. I think in a certain way, I'm actually extremely sympathetic to what you're saying, extremely sympathetic in a way that I'll try to explain. So and I think the way in which this sort of transition of ways of talking about power amongst these early modern theorists, I think really bears on that very point that you're making. So for Spinoza, some people might think of power as being able, in the individual human case, being able to do what you want or something like that, or some specification, something like that. So it has to have some mediation. There's something you want to do, and then can you do it, or something like that. Now, in his ethics and in this more narrow, in this sort of individual case, Spinoza thinks that actually rejects it there. And so he thinks that it actually shows a deficiency of your power sometimes, that you're just doing whatever you want. Because sometimes if what you want is somehow just this, you're sort of pushed around by passions and by fads and by whatever idea comes at you and by things you're afraid of, even if you effectively get what you want on the basis of all of those processes that lead you to have whatever particular will you want, that's not particular. He thinks that can actually shows a certain sign of weakness, that you're vulnerable to whatever passions or events push you around. And for him, on an individual level, the individual power lies in, he's got his own way of specifying it, but it's to do with having constituted yourself in such a way that you act on the basis of, he says it on the basis of your nature, but it's like you act in a consistent way that doesn't get buffeted around by emotions and fads and by other people suggesting ideas to you, that you have some sort of solid action in accord, which doesn't get, which is consistent and doesn't get swayed by external events. And I think that at the political level, the same thing goes. And so this is what I like about this approach. Rather than thinking of power in terms of will, if you recognize that will, both at the individual level and certainly at the political level, can get generated by all sorts of random occurrences that you might not actually value. So for instance, in Australia a number of years ago, when Kevin Rudd got kicked out, it was transparently the result of him annoying the mining companies paying many millions of dollars for all-out media assault to undermine him, and then he got kicked out as Prime Minister. And so I think the idea that the popular will that was produced by the mining campaign, of course, on the one hand, Schumpeter's idea is, well, if all wills are like this, why do we bother respecting them at all? Let's throw out the idea of popular power. But then for Schumpeter, he's left with this very minimal proceduralist notion of democracy. Democracy just is, there's a competition and whoever wins, and there's nothing to be said about something being more genuinely popular or not. And so I kind of like this suspicion of will, but what I think I try to bring in is the idea that even you can leave out the idea of a popular will, which is normally tied to an idea of popular power. You can have an idea of popular power that isn't so tightly tied to that. And so if the result of that is something that doesn't sound like power to you, I'm kind of fine with that, right? And so I think the rhetorical value of still calling it power is it's trying to show this is still supposed to be answering to some needs of democratic theory, in terms of how can you say the people are in charge if you don't want to put value, first of all, on the expressed will of the people. And so in a certain way, you used some language, you said that the effects, constantly effects are being produced in all sorts of ways by the people. And there's something, it's not driven by one sort of intention, it's sort of mechanical in a certain sort of way. And I think, yes, that's good. And under some circumstances, you look at this aggregate production of effects within a society, which is a combination. I'm not interested in the separation between people and government. I think people, government, everything all in together. There's certain production of effects. Sometimes You might say, oh, is it always popular power? My point is that sometimes the kind of efficacy of a society is kind of is weak, in the sense it's erratic. Like, think of the American response to coronavirus. It can't get its act together and have any effects. Or sometimes it's might be quite efficacious, but reliably act for, you know, certain vested interests or powerful, you know, the wealthy or whatever in a particular society. And so, yes, in all cases, we're looking at whatever this mechanical aggregate production of effects is. And I suppose I'm proposing you call that power, even though it's not linked to a will, and you call it popular, not because it's linked to an expression of will, first and foremost, but because it maintains equality, maintains this equal domain of participation. You complained that I seem to say popular power, what it is and what achieves it are same thing, and that's no accident, right? I think that's no accident. Actually, then, in the way of, for the Aristotelian view, a power is always distinct from the act that it generates. That's what it is to have a power. It's something that explains acts. Whereas I think in this perspective I want to put forward, there's nothing behind. There's no sort of behind of it. So yeah, that it would be the case to say, you know, to say that a regime has popular power is, you know, its popular power is something about, you know, equality participation, and it's generated by equality and participation. But the devil will be in the detail of how you bring that about. And in the chapter that I have at the end, I tried to use, I mean, there's often this idea that if only we had more direct democracy, then all our problems would be over. And I think that I try to use the ins and outs of looking at Spinoza's institutional things to show that he thinks direct assembly decision-making is very appropriate, but under specific conditions. So in an aristocracy, he thinks it's very appropriate. Why? Because for direct participation to yield the sort of, you know, within the domain of aristocrats, in this case, the egalitarian effect that you want, you have to have all of the people in the direct democracy, you know, everybody doing it who's supposed to be doing it, and they're all fully engaged and concentrating. And if you have, and for that, and I try to say for that reason, when he's thinking about mass, not an aristocracy, when he's thinking about a mass assembly, he no longer recommends direct democracy, because if you've got all these people who've got caring responsibilities and jobs and stuff, unlike the aristocrats, then they're not all gonna, you know, as soon as you don't have the direct participants all equally fully engaged, then it's at prey for whatever sort of interested, powerful actors to kind of distort it despite its democratic form. So let me have a little bit of a look over. I tried to take some notes while you're asking. So I like the way that your comments are pressing, saying, why do we talk about power? Doesn't that anthropomorphize the polity in a problematic way? I like that, because part of my objective is to try to have this somewhat this view of power that doesn't rely on searching for this expression of will, which I think is one of the ways a problem for democratic theorizing. It's true, I think what's wrong with using, you know, why do I use this? What's the difference if I call this popular power, if I call that popular power? Well, if you're committed to talking about democracy in terms of popular power, then you need some way that makes sense to talk about it. If you've got a way of talking about democracy without talking about popular power, super. But if you want to talk about democracy, talk about it in the way that the radical Democrats talk about popular power, I think you're setting yourself up for disappointment in terms of this oscillation between, here's the power of the people, oh, oops, the power of the people made terrible decisions, how can I still be a Democrat, right? If you can talk about democracy without even appealing to a notion of popular power, great. But if you want one, here is my gift to you of one which I hope makes better sense.
What's the difference between popular power and constituent power?
Okay, at least in the way that in the way that constituent power is used in, for instance, like Sears and various other people. Constituent power would be one variety or one way of talking about this radical democratic power that I'm criticizing. So constituent power is normally the word you have when you're contrasting the people prior to what they constitute, which is whatever set of institutions and, you know, legal documents and whatever. And so there's this sort of somehow more primordial thing that sets up that. And that's what is normally called constituent power. And that's the kind of idea that I want to throw in the rubbish.
Okay.
Okay, so final, I mean, there was a lot in your comments. I hope I've touched on some of the main things. One thing that you said, question of the Rawlsian influence here. Now, I was at grad school at what was sort of cheekily described by its, critics as the international center, like the global Rawlsian center, international, where everybody was talking in Rawls, and I felt myself somewhat on the outside of that, but maybe there's been some kind of effect. I don't know. I mean, the funny thing about Rawls is, I think in some ways, when I think about either on the question of equality or the question of democracy, I see myself as quite different. I mean, Rawls I try to characterize equality in terms of nobody, nobody being, sort of a non-domination notion, which I don't think I see in Rawls. I think for Rawls, he's more concerned with his, these ideas of, what count, in justice as fairness, he's talking about what's fair without so much thinking about this more political question of what does inequality result in terms of people's status as equal citizens. So I suppose I'm very influenced by Elizabeth Anderson, who's kind of like a late Rawlsian, and she puts this idea of equal status as citizens very centrally. So not Rawls himself, but later Rawlsians. I think Elizabeth Anderson's been very influential for me. What Rawls focuses his discussion of democracy on public reason, and it's all concerned about defining what is this sort of domain of reasonable questions and how can they communicate with each other. I see my approach as quite different to that, but you might be right that it somehow bears the trace of me reading too much of that as a graduate student.
I mean, you did say something in your comments. I'm trying to find, because I wrote it down.
Oh, sure.
Which did make me think that you were adopting a position on the need for public reason, public good, public mindedness, all meaning the same thing. I can't find it now, but I did have that feeling. So if you're moving away from that position and allowing people within the context of popular power to nevertheless express their own eccentric and personal experiences, and to legitimately seek to deploy popular power in their own personal interests, then that would be something else. But I didn't think that was consistent with what you were.
I suppose that I do use the word like common good and like, public, and so I use it quite carelessly, I guess. I use it quite carelessly. And I suppose I normally use it as a counterpoint to oligarchy. And so when I try to talk about what's public and what's common, I'm thinking in terms of the counterpoint to it being distorted by powerful vested interests, right? So, people with deep pockets or whatever. And so, but I suppose but within, compatible with that, I'm sort of quite, there's these left Schmittians who have this idea that the way you get a good public order is by having people like really like screaming at each other and, really quite unreasonable contests, if you see what I mean, that people don't agree on ground principles, but they all come together and try to hash it out. And that involves
screaming at each other. I mean, I'm sympathetic to that position.
Yeah,
but that's different from screaming each other. That yes. Is it. I would defend that. It's not my book, so it's your book. But I'm just saying, I think that there's a value to that, which I'm sympathetic, which is maybe, but I understand. I mean, that's not the Rawlsian vision, and I don't think that's your vision. So that's why I conflated you two.
On that point, I think I'd have to actually, I mean, there may be many ways in which I might be assimilated to certain Rawlsian positions, but not on that particular one. I mean, one of the things that people like about Spinoza, and which I endorse about Spinoza, is he's got this idea that because the important thing is what the durable outcomes are, it doesn't really matter if it turns out that, it could be that, having this sort of very Rawlsian idea where everybody has to be very nice and sort of respect reasonable language and reasonable people. If that came to be the good way to get this outcome, great. But I think Spinoza lies in this Machiavellian tradition, which also runs through the Schmittians, which is the idea that actually there's all sorts of tendencies for there certain to be elitist closure of reasonable discourse, and it should be expected that you're going to have rabble-rousers yelling from the outside, and that shouldn't be seen as a problem. That should be welcomed, that should be welcomed, so that can actually help to self-correct a polity. So I take it that actually it's more the Hobbesian view that you don't want that conflict's always going to end up in problems. I think if maybe buried in amongst all of the verbiage, I think there's this left Schmittian idea. I kind of endorse it, although I think the left Schmittians are a bit too sanguine that it's always the case that conflict is productive and positive. I think they're a bit too sanguine about that, but the idea that it can be, and often that a polity is like Machiavelli says, a polity without what are the Roman plebs running out of the houses and running out of the city because they're grumpy about something. If you don't have that, you tend to end up with a very aristocratic regime, and I think I'm sympathetic to that.